everyone. Good afternoon. My name is T. Ariakini, and I will be your moderator today for this session brought to you by the Community Engagement and Education Division at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. For full accessibility today, it is critical that speakers first identify themselves by name before proceeding to speak and mute their microphones after they are done speaking. We have ASL interpreters on screen, and live card captioning is available by turning on subtitles using the CC icon on the lower part of the screen. We will have a question and answer portion during today's session, and attendees can use the Q&A function on the lower part of the screen to type in questions for our panelists at any time. With that said, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the launch of our 2024 MI, spelled M-I, Response to Hate virtual campaign forums. This series will feature a new installment of hate and bias awareness programming each month from now through September, when the campaign ends with our annual My Response to Hate conference. Right now, let's take a look at the PSA our team developed to capture the spirit of the My Response to Hate campaign. Please watch.
Did you know that race is the #1 motivating factor for hate crimes in the United States?
Did you know that hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased by over 73% since 2019?
Did you know that there are state and federal laws that protect you against hate crimes and bias incidents?
The Michigan Department of Civil Rights and the Michigan Alliance Against Hate Crimes have launched the My Response to Hate campaign to inform Michiganders of hate crimes and bias incidents occurring in Michigan.
You can take action in your own way by showing love, not hate.
If you see something, say something.
Support victims. Report the incident.
Make a commitment.
My response to hate.
My response to hate.
My response to hate.
My response to hate is love.
Visit michigan.gov/MDCR for more information on hate crimes, bias incidents, and available resources.
Did you?
So it is our hope that these forums provide you with the information pertaining to hate and bias prevention that you can implement and use in your daily lives, at your places of work, in your schools, and in your communities. So today, our focus is voting and violence, which is both timely and relevant as we enter into a presidential election year with tensions already arising across the political landscape. Our presenters are experts on the topic, and they come to us from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the U.S. Department of Justice, the ACLU, and the Oakland County Clerk's Office. Their presentations today will not only educate Michigan citizens on our voting rights, but also ways that we can ensure safety and accessibility for all as we exercise our right to vote. The biographies for each presenter were made available via the registration link for this event. However, they will also be shared with all registered participants following this program. First up, we have Carter Wynn and Nadia Aziz of the Fighting Hate and Bias program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. They are going to talk to us about hate crime trends and general elections. Carter and Nadia, you now have the platform.
Good afternoon, folks. This is Carter speaking. Like Tara said, I'm the program manager for the Fighting Hate and Bias program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I use she, her pronouncing off the presentation today. My colleague and senior partner, Nadia Aziz, will be introduced when she presents on her portion of the deck. You can go to the next slide. To start off, I'll give a quick rundown. Oh, next slide. Yeah, thanks. Of what we're presenting on today. We'll do a quick overview of our organization and our team, and then I'm going to talk a bit about our 2024 Cause for Concern report. Nadia will conclude with more context on the current climate and recommendations for mitigating the violent trends we're seeing around elections. Next slide, please. For those who aren't familiar with our organization, we were founded in 1950 and we're the nation's oldest and most diverse coalition-based civil and human rights organization. We have more than 240 members from all over the country, and the heart of our coalition is our task forces, comprised of coalition members who have expertise in each of our issue areas, including hate crimes. Next slide. Our specific program, Fighting Hate and Bias, is concerned with combating the normalization of hate and dehumanization towards specific communities. And as many of you know, hate crimes and hate incidents have been steadily rising over the course of the last few years, and our team's work is more important than ever. In partnership with the Hate Crime Task Force, our team uses a variety of tactics to address the rise, including things like campaign mobilization, rapid response protocols, and engaging with directly impacted communities. We analyze hate crime policy and engage with the administration on national security and domestic terrorism measures. Next slide. And you can go to the next slide. Our Cause for Concern 2024 report is the most recent publication in the Leadership Conference's Cause for Concern series that was first published in 1997. And the report outlines the unmistakable pattern that's emerged during the last 4 presidential campaign cycles, reported hate crimes during elections. And while not all hate crimes and hate incidences are committed by white supremacists, the vast majority of these incidents have been fueled directly by white supremacy. The Trump presidency empowered white nationalists and provided them with a platform and allowed them to move more mainstream. And it's no surprise that today's political climate is highly charged, making it so much easier for conspiracy theories and disinformation to spread like wildfire, amplifying hate further. Attempts to whitewash history and deny the rights of marginalized communities have become campaign platforms. And then on top of that, social media companies have failed to effectively enforce policies that curb and prevent the spread of hate and voting disinformation online. Many of these platforms have cut back their trust and safety staff and hollowed out protections. Next slide. So the FBI began publishing data on hate crime in 1991, but because law enforcement agencies do not have to report any data, the published data doesn't show the full picture. And this is something that Nadia is going to be touching on in more depth later in the presentation. In more recent election cycles, white supremacist hate and specifically white nationalists have played a big role in driving this trend. White supremacy is a racist ideology that rests on the belief that the white race is inherently superior to all other races. And white nationalism has been used as an attempt to cloak white supremacist ideas with the language of racial separatism. Perpetrators of mass violence have cited these racist conspiracies as motivating factors for their attacks, from Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh to Walmart in El Paso to the supermarket in Buffalo, New York. Next slide, please. So 2008 general election. So while this year was a historic and really joyful election for many, with the celebration of the first Black president in the US history, it was also energizing for a more sinister and hateful reason. The 2008 election provided a clear sign that the racial demographics of the US were shifting, and consequently, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and far-right militia movements began to organize in the US. The final weeks of 2008 saw an increase in hate crimes targeting racial and ethnic minorities. Less than a month before Election Day, 2 white supremacists were arrested for planning to kill Black school children and assassinate then-Senator Obama. Just days before President Obama was elected, a Black church was burned to the ground. And according to the FBI, there were 2,951 anti-Black hate crimes in 2008 as racial tensions grew during the run-up and the aftermath of that year's presidential election. Next slide, please. So 2012 general election. So in response to Obama's electoral popularity, white nationalists spoke of the end of traditional America, and many white nationalist leaders saw 2012 as their last chance to make their case to white America, recruiting and mobilizing like-minded individuals. Accordingly, reported hate crimes increased in 2012 by 5%. Particularly devastating example occurred on August 5th when a white supremacist opened fire in a Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, killing 6. The DOJ labeled this mass shooting both as a hate crime and as an act of terror. And this was the first mass hate crime that would soon become a pattern of white nationalists targeting houses of worship and other public spaces. Next slide. 2016 general election. So when candidate Trump announced his campaign in 2015, he immediately set the tone for his campaign and began fanning the flames of hate and emboldening white supremacists. Hate crimes have been on the rise since 2015 and have not returned to pre-2016 election cycle numbers. And, the 2016 election cycle saw devastating acts of violence. On June 17th, 2015, white supremacists who sought to start a race war targeted Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, killing 9 Black churchgoers. Anti-Muslim bigotry was a clear trend in the 2016 campaign rhetoric. And a day after President Trump signed the first Muslim ban, a mosque in Victoria, Texas was burned to the ground. And the Latino and immigrant communities were also the target of violent hate and white supremacist harassment. On June 12, 2016, the mass shooting at Pulse nightclub occurred. And even though the FBI didn't report this as a hate crime, 49 people, many of whom were Latino, were killed during the attack that targeted the LGBTQ+ community. The month that President Trump was elected in 2016, our country saw the highest number of hate crimes reported in more than a decade. Next slide. So getting closer to current day, 2020 general election. The 2020 election cycle saw a jump of more than 13% on reported hate crimes. The FBI reported 2,755 anti-Black hate crimes in 2020, an increase from the 1,972 reported in 2019. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, the anti-Asian bigotry was stoked by public figures like Trump. Between March 19th and April 15th, 1,497 incidents of anti-Asian discrimination related to COVID were reported, including 219 incidents that were either a physical assault or being coughed on or spat. I'm going to now pass it over to my colleague Nadia to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Carter. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to chat a little bit more about hate crime data and get into the current climate and 2024 election cycle, and then I'll conclude with recommendations. So often when we talk about hate crimes and hate crime data, we hear about how the data is notoriously underreported. This is well known, and it is for a couple of different reasons that I believe folks will get into in greater detail later on. First of all, not all hate incidents are reported to law enforcement. This is for a lot of different reasons, ranging from a historic distrust of law enforcement to a feeling that maybe nothing will be done, and other reasons as well. Another reason that Carter mentioned for why hate crimes are underreported is because law enforcement agencies are not required to submit hate crime data up to the FBI. It is voluntary, which means that there are a lot of law enforcement agencies that do not submit data. However, even though we know that there are gaps in this data, we also know that the data that does exist shows trends. And one of those trends that we've been discussing is the increase in hate crimes during presidential election cycles. So let's look briefly at 2021 and 2022, just kind of high-level overview of hate crime data. 2021 saw an over 30% increase in reported hate crimes from the previous year. And the FBI data from October 2023, which is the most recent data, showed that 2022 saw a 7% increase from 2021. This makes 2022 the third consecutive year of the highest number of reported hate crimes on record. And 2022 was also, I believe, the fifth consecutive year where there was a decline in the number of law enforcement agencies that were reporting data up to the FBI. So we know that while the data is showing a record high number, we also know that the data is significantly underreported. And there are two primary sources to kind of demonstrate the scale of this. There's two primary sources of government data on hate crimes. We have the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, which is the source of the data that we've been discussing. This is data that law enforcement reports up to the FBI every year. There's also the National Crime Victimization Survey, and this is conducted through a different method of household surveys. It is from the victim perspective that's reported directly through the survey. And that survey includes data about incidents that are both reported to law enforcement and not reported to law enforcement. And when you look at that report, there's about, I believe, 66% of hate crime victimizations go unreported to law enforcement. So the 2022 data showed over 11,000 hate crimes from the UCR, and compare that to the National Crime Victimization Survey from 2010 to 2019, which showed about 250,000 hate crime victimizations occur on average in the United States every year. And that is almost 30 hate crimes an hour. So we know the data shows trends, but it really doesn't show the full scope of what communities are experiencing on the ground. We talk a lot about data, we talk a lot about numbers, but each one of these data points is a story about someone who has suffered at the hands of bias and hate. So I'm going to chat a little bit about the 2024 election cycle, which we are in the midst of right now. Carter discussed the political climate tends to grow more divisive during election cycles. More inflammatory things are said, public dialogue is more intense, and we've seen this how, just broadly speaking, there is a parallel between the political climate and the number of reported hate crimes. And we are, of course, concerned that the 2024 general election cycle will be no different from the previous cycles. Since we have published the Cause for Concern report in April of last year, there have been sort of additional layers added to this tense climate that have complicated it further, which I'll chat about here in a moment. So there are a few things that have contributed to this climate of increased hate going into 2024. First, there have been attacks on teaching about race and gender, attacks on school diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. There have been so-called critical race theory bans, and all of this led to a wave of legislation being introduced at the state levels. I'm sure the number is much higher now, but at the time of the report, it was over 350 pieces of so-called anti-critical race theory legislation had been introduced across the country. We also have a wave of anti-LGBTQ plus bills that have been introduced in state legislatures across the country. These have largely been focused on the transgender community and specifically transgender children. And these movements have kind of been amplified by social media platforms. So we also have the use of online hate as a contributing factor in this climate. The Human Rights Campaign, which is one of our wonderful partners, published a great report called Digital Hate. And this report discussed the frequency in which hate appears in our social media feeds and how that feeds and normalizes untrue narratives. So disinformation online has been running rampant, and including a wave of hateful disinformation about the LGBTQ plus community, saying that they, quote, groom children. This has been spread online and has contributed to the increase in these anti-LGBT bills across the country. It contributes to a climate where not everyone feels or even is safe. Now, on top of all of these current factors, which were discussed in our Cause for Concern report, I also wanted to mention what is called the backlash effect. And this is what many communities are experiencing right now. So the backlash effect, we know hate crimes increase during general elections. We've also seen that hate crimes can increase in the wake of violence abroad. That's currently what many communities are experiencing right now. This has been evident since the most recent outbreak of violence in the Middle East. Hate incidents targeting the Arab, Jewish, Muslim communities across the country have skyrocketed. And Michigan, I know, has a very large population of Arab Americans and American Muslims. I can guarantee they're feeling a lot of this right now. So it's important that as we go into this election, we continue to call out hate in all forms, that we continue to call out anti-Semitism, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim hate. We need to name it, and we need to counter the message that hate crimes send. So let's go on to the next slide to chat about our recommendations. Okay, we have 4 primary recommendations that we discussed in this report. I'll go into each of them here. We have the social media companies must invest in deplatforming hate for upcoming elections. We must continue to confront and address white supremacist violence in a way that does not further criminalize communities of color. Congress must make hate crime reporting mandatory, and public officials and all of us must continue to speak out against hate. So let's go to the next slide. So this one is fairly simple. Social media platforms need to be accountable for the role they play in increased hate. Platforms need to ensure that they're resourcing content moderation teams appropriately to meet the challenge of increased hate during general election cycles. They need to be able to monitor live stream content in real time, for example. There have been mass layoffs in the tech world. Companies really need to rebuild their safety teams, their teams that monitor disinformation, and of course, their content moderation teams. Platforms should be able to capture inauthentic behavior and disinformation before it spreads widely. And very importantly, they need to close loopholes that allow candidates and public figures to espouse disinformation. Next slide. So next up, the federal government must confront and address white supremacist violence without further criminalizing communities of color, religious minorities, and other marginalized communities. It's really important that we keep hate crime enforcement in the civil rights space. And I say this, we detail it a bit more in our report, which I hope you'll all take a look at. There is an overlap in the definitions in federal law between a hate crime and an act of domestic terrorism. But hate crimes have long been a civil rights issue. It's in large part why the Civil Rights Division at DOJ was founded many, many years ago. But in more recent years, public dialogue has started shifting and using more of the lexicon of the national security framework. This is a framework that has historically targeted and harmed racial and religious and ethnic minorities, largely in the post 9/11 world. So we need to make sure that we are keeping hate crime enforcement in the civil rights space. Next slide. I chatted about this briefly already. Congress really needs to make hate crime data reporting mandatory. We need to be able to see what communities are experiencing on the ground. I'll take it a step further than that. We also need to understand and know the stories behind the data points. We are making progress in terms of getting to mandatory reporting. In 2021, President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. This included the Jabara Hire No Hate Act. And together, this legislation, this law, works to incentivize hate crime data reporting. This is an important step towards getting towards mandatory reporting, but we're not there yet. Next slide. And lastly, public officials must speak out against hate. And it's important that they don't just speak out against hate, but that they name it. Hate crimes are message crimes. And to help counter the impact that they have, we really need to counter the messages that perpetrators are seeking to send. Anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, transphobia, all forms of hate should be excluded from campaign tactics. And that I am happy to answer questions at the end of the session, but that is all we have for now.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you both so much for that very compelling presentation. You really have given us a lot to consider regarding actions that we can take to combat hate and bias when it comes to general elections. I would like to remind our viewing audience once again that all of our presenters will be available during the Q&A session at the very end of today's program. So please continue to put your questions in the Q&A function. For now, we are going to continue our discussion with a presentation by the U.S. Department of Justice. Please join me in welcoming Assistant U.S. Attorney Kaylin Pruss, Timothy Mellett, Deputy Chief of the Voting Section of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and Assistant U.S. Attorney Lutrell Livingston, who are going to educate us on the work that the DOJ is doing to fight against hate in the community. They are also going to give us a greater understanding of voting rights. Ms. Pruss, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. This is Kaylin Pruss speaking. So my presentation is part of a broader Department of Justice initiative called United Against Hate. The goal of this nationwide initiative is to provide community members with the resources to better identify and report potential hate crimes so that together we can work to prevent them and bring perpetrators to justice. Next slide. So I will start by taking a step back from the Leadership Conference's presentation and taking a few minutes to discuss what hate crimes are from the federal perspective and why hate crimes are treated differently than other crimes. What makes hate crimes different than other crimes is the motivation element. In general, a hate crime is a criminal offense, such as a murder, assault, arson, vandalism, or threats, that is motivated by animus against a group or class of people. The word hate in this context does not mean rage, anger, or general dislike. Rather, it means bias against people or groups with specific characteristics that are defined by law. Next slide. What are those characteristics? Federal law covers certain crimes motivated by hate of someone's race, color, national origin, religion, disability, sexual orientation, family status, sex, gender, and gender identity, depending on the statute. It also covers crimes committed because of someone's perceived membership in one of those groups. For example, after the September 11th attacks, the Justice Department prosecuted a number of hate crimes that were committed against Sikh individuals who were targeted because the perpetrators mistakenly believed them to be Muslim. Other federal laws protect these same groups of people from discrimination, which we will talk about shortly. Next slide. The Justice Department, including U.S. attorneys' offices, enforces a number of federal hate crime statutes. I want to briefly highlight just a few of them. First, under the Shepherd-Bird Hate Crimes Prevention Act, it is a crime to willfully inflict bodily injury or attempt to do so using a dangerous weapon because of someone's actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, or disability. Second, it is a federal crime to use force or threaten to use force to willfully interfere with someone else's exercise of their own civil rights. That means that it is a crime to threaten to prevent someone else from enjoying their right to education, employment, transportation, public accommodation, etc., because of their race, color, religion, or national origin. Third, it is a federal crime to conspire with others to interfere with someone's enjoyment of their own civil rights in the ways I just mentioned. And finally, it is a federal crime to intentionally damage religious property because of the religious character of that property, or to intentionally obstruct someone else from exercising their religion. Now, something that comes up in the enforcement of all of these laws, and I see in the chat, is the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which gives people the right to express themselves even if their message is one of hate. But under the First Amendment, there are still limits to free speech, particularly when that speech is advocating or threatening violence or encouraging people to commit crimes. True threats, meaning statements where the speaker means to communicate a serious expression of intent to commit an act of unlawful violence against particular individuals, is outside the bounds of protected speech. So regardless of whether conduct is protected speech or a hate crime, we still encourage you to report any concerning incidents to law enforcement because it may alert authorities to an ongoing threat or help with the investigation of a later hate crime. Sometimes prior conduct may serve as evidence that later conduct indeed was motivated by hate or bias. So in short, it's our job to figure out whether the First Amendment applies, not yours. Next slide. That's right, next slide again. Another reason to report incidents, even if you are not sure whether they rise to the level of hate crimes, is that they might constitute discrimination. Some hate incidents, like bullying and harassment in schools and mistreatment in housing and hotels and employment, may violate federal anti-discrimination laws. These laws are civil laws, not criminal laws, so people who violate them don't go to prison and we don't bring charges against them. But we can still investigate and seek remedies like back pay, damages, and court orders requiring training or preventing future violations. And we can seek policy change to prevent future harm. Next slide. The statutes listed on this slide are just some of the civil rights statutes that we enforce, and likely they are familiar to many of you. Our jurisdiction, that is DOJ's jurisdiction, To enforce these statutes varies. Some we enforce with other agency partners. Others require us to identify a pattern of violations before we can take action. I'm happy to discuss the complexities of those later on during Q&A or offline if anyone has specific questions about particular statutes or the scope of our authority under those statutes. And in a few minutes, my colleagues will do a deeper dive and discuss some of the protections we enforce under the Voting Rights Act specifically. Next slide. Now that we have a better understanding of how to identify a hate crime, let's talk about what you should do when one occurs. Next slide. First, it is important to immediately call 911. This is true for many rights violations, not just hate crimes. If something is potentially an emergency, do not hesitate to call law enforcement if you are comfortable doing so. Then, once everyone is safe, we encourage you to contact your local FBI field office to report the crime so they can investigate and determine whether any federal hate crimes laws were violated. You can do this by submitting a tip online at www.fbi.gov/tips or calling your local FBI field office at the number that you find online. The FBI is one of our closest partners, especially on hate crimes work. The FBI field office will alert us, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Civil Rights Division if an incident may implicate federal civil rights laws. They also work closely with local law enforcement and impacted communities and do a great deal of outreach and training in the civil rights area. As Nadia noted, reporting hate crimes to local law enforcement, which you can do by calling 911, is critical because it can help the police stop dangerous people before they harm anyone else. Reporting can also alert police to hate issues in the community that they might not be aware of and devote resources accordingly. But we understand that sometimes reporting a crime to the police or the FBI may be challenging or scary based on historic relationships or lack of trust. Next slide. Which is why we also encourage you to report hate crimes and civil rights violations to us being the Justice Department. You can contact your local U.S. Attorney's Office or the Civil Rights Division if you witness or experience a hate crime. The contact information is on this slide. As I noted throughout this presentation, DOJ is a resource for you. There are many agencies at the federal and state and local level that all work to prevent and address hate crimes, and sometimes that can be confusing. So if you have a question, just feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to get you to the right place. We work very closely with all of our agency partners, and you shouldn't have to call through many to get an answer. We can help direct you to where you need to go. Next slide. When reporting a hate crime or a civil rights violation, please share as much detail as possible with law enforcement to help them investigate. Some of the most helpful types of information are listed here, and they include whether the victim is a member of a protected class, one of the classes I listed earlier, and the perpetrator is not, whether the perpetrator made any comments or written statements or gestures, or was a member of an organized or informal hate group, any drawings, markings, or graffiti that were seen near the scene of the incident, or whether other incidences had happened previously in the same place, whether that place is a religious site or a place of significance to people in a protected class, and the victim or witness's impression of the incident and the motive of the offender. Reporting these factors to law enforcement can help make the difference between whether an incident is properly classified as a hate crime or not. Next slide. Another reason to report hate crimes to the federal government is so we can collect better data. Nadia discussed the FBI's annual hate crime statistics report, so I will move through this quickly, but I just want to emphasize again the scale of underreporting that we see in the data. This chart shows that there were 10,530 hate crimes reported to the FBI in the most recent report, and the demographic breakdown of who was targeted. Many of you may be looking at this chart and thinking 10,000 hate crimes sounds really low compared to the population of the United States. And it is. There is significant underreporting again. There are over 18,000 federal law, or not federal, 18,000 local law enforcement agencies in the US. And in 2021, almost 15,000 voluntarily submitted information to the FBI regarding hate crimes, but 80% of those reported zero, that no hate crimes were committed. That can't be right. So we need better data and reporting so we can better respond to and prevent hate crimes. Next slide. So why aren't people reporting hate crimes to the police? Nadia touched on this. The most common reason given by victims is that they handled the incident another way, such as privately or through a non-law enforcement official, but 1/4 of victims believed that the police could not or would not do anything to help. We are working to address that issue, including by providing additional training and resources to law enforcement to improve hate crimes investigations and reporting. We also have to do more to improve community policing relationships and continue to build trust. These presentations are a small part of that effort. Next slide. So I just want to close by noting that this presentation is part of a short part of a longer presentation that us and the Eastern District and other U.S. Attorney's offices have been making to communities across the state and across the country. If you are interested in learning more or having us make a similar presentation to your organization or community, please reach out. My contact information is on the next slide. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to my colleagues, Tim Mellett and Luttrell Livingston, to talk about the Justice Department's enforcement of the Voting Rights Act.
Hi, I am Tim Mellett, and it's Tim Mellett speaking, and I'm a deputy chief in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, and then going to have a discussion with Luttrell Livingston, who's the executive assistant U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, about a case we did together in East Point, Michigan. So here's the statute, the Voting Rights Act. Next slide. One of the things that is important is that the Voting Rights Act applies to every jurisdiction, and it prevents the denial or abridgment of the right to vote based on race, color, or membership in a language minority group. And you may be thinking, well, what is abridgment? Something that is going to make it harder for people to vote. And that can be any number of things. For example, if there is a bogus challenge, somebody who shouldn't be challenged, but is being challenged, for example, based on their race or ethnicity, can be forced to go in a different line, fill out additional forms, and all sorts of things can be done where it then creates longer lines. That, for example, is something that makes it harder for people to vote. Next slide. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits intentional racial discrimination voting, as well as conduct with a racially discriminatory result. And so what that means is oftentimes it is hard to prove that somebody had an intent to do something. For example, it may be that it's very difficult to prove, in my previous example, that there were polling officials who intended to make it harder. But if the result is such that everybody who is coming in, who is being challenged, is of a particular race or ethnicity, the fact is that that alone suffices to demonstrate a violation of Section 2. Next slide. So the we're going to go, actually, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Vote denial is, there are in general two types of violations that we look at under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The first is vote denial, which also includes abridgment. And the second is vote dilution. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the Supreme Court has recently had a number of voting rights cases that have gone before it. And one of the things that it discusses is that vote denial involves time, place, or manner restrictions that affect an individual voter's ability to exercise the right to vote. We have brought cases when jurisdictions have tried to limit that. For example, if they had allowed drop boxes before and weren't allowing them now, if you're limiting absentee voting and changing that where you were allowing before, you're restricting it now. If, for example, there are things as simple as where people before could offer you a bottle of water as you sit and wait in line, waiting to get up to someplace, and now you can't do that. Next slide. So one of the things that I talked about, had mentioned earlier, was the challenge about intentional targeting of registered voters based on race. The first case that is mentioned here is United States versus Long County, Georgia. Literally, the challenges were based anybody who had a Latino surname was being singled out, and they were saying, "Oh, Gonzalez, I challenge that person as not a citizen." Likewise, next person come in and they have a surname of Garcia, and they were being challenged. That sort of information, you have to have particularized information in order to be able to make a challenge. And these sort of blanket challenge based on how somebody looks or how, somebody's last name is something that violates Section 2. I wanted to specifically mention our lawsuit against the city of Hamtramck. In that case, Hamtramck was sued because of race-based challenges directed at Arab Americans. The facts there had showed that in the general election officials had required Arab American voters to take an oath as a condition to voting without requiring a factual basis for any challenge. So just simply because somebody looks a certain way, because somebody has a name, you can't require a different voting process. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about vote dilution. And the vote dilution is something that, as it says here, is that, for example, dealing with a redistricting plan that minimizes or cancels out the voting strength of racial minorities in the voting population. And I'm not going to deal with it here. Happy to discuss in the Q&A, the case in Michigan dealing with redistricting. There's some complexities there on that. Next slide, please. So one of the examples of where vote dilution is found is an at-large voting scheme can operate to keep a racial minority from being able to have an effective vote. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, move to the next slide. And we're going to get into a discussion about the city of East Point. Before I bring Latrell in here, I just wanted to set the stage in particular, saying that in the city of East Point, Black voters had been unable to elect their candidates of choice because of polarized voting. And you may say, well, what is polarized voting? In essence, what was happening is that Black voters were voting for Black candidates who were running for city council, and they were losing. And white voters were voting for the white candidates who were opposing those candidates, and they always won. And when you have polarized voting in something like that, it can be difficult, because if you're a minority of the population and one segment of the population always votes one way, then you're unable to be able to get representation. So Latrell, I'm going to bring you in here, and I want you to, if you could highlight some of the things that we faced in that East Point case.
Thanks, Tim. Well, those of you that are from Metro Detroit may be familiar with the municipality of East Point, formerly called East Detroit, which is directly adjacent to the city of Detroit and historically had not had a very large Black population. That started to change after 2000 as the population of Black individuals grew in the city. And what we had seen over the course of several elections that, as Tim alluded to, that Black voters could not elect their candidates of choice. So we investigated and ultimately decided to bring a lawsuit under Section 2. One thing to sort of connect this back to what Tim had talked about earlier is the city of East Point had an at-large voting system. They are not unique in this. Most municipalities in Michigan have at-large city councils. So we were not alleging that the system of voting, the method of election, was designed with the intent to prevent Black voters. It existed before there were Black voters in East Point. But we did have to show that there had been a history of racial discrimination in the community. And then as Tim explained, we had to show that we saw polarized voting in East Point, and we were able to deploy some technology to predictive looking at different voters and see that the community of Black voters were repeatedly losing in these at-large city council elections where Blacks could represent between a third and 40% of the vote, but still couldn't elect 1 out of 5 city council members. We litigated the suit starting in 2017, and the city of East Point was very, very against what is our normal remedy in a case like this, which would be to create districts in the city for city council, and so that was a barrier for a long time in trying to resolve the case. Ultimately, Tim and I and the rest of our team were able to negotiate a consent decree with the city of East Point, where they tried a novel voting strategy, which was ranked choice of voting. And so by implementing ranked choice voting as part of our consent decree, they were actually able to achieve the ensure that Black voters had the opportunity to select their candidates of choice, which was our concern, which without going to a district voting, which was their concern, which they thought would further polarize their community. So we were able to resolve the case through that consent decree in 2019. And the city kept that method of election in place for 2 cycles through 2021, I believe. And ultimately, they actually opted to go back to their prior at-large, but the dynamics and demographics in the city have changed as such now that Black voters and white voters can all elect their candidates of choice because of the changed demographics in the city without involvement from our consent decree.
Yeah, this is Tim Mellett speaking. Yeah, no, I think that it does point out, as Latrell brought up, there are different ways to resolve these issues. You may find, for example, that there are changing circumstances, and something, for example, like ranked choice voting allowed people to be able to elect their candidates of choice. And so in something like that, in that case, we thought that was a particularly good remedy. So I'm going to move to the next slide now, which is there a private right of action under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? And the answer to that is yes. There have literally been hundreds of cases brought by private plaintiffs since the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965. The issue, though, and the reason this is brought up right now, is because in the Eighth Circuit, of which Michigan is not a part, but you think the states of Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, Arkansas. Though in those states, the Eighth Circuit had found that private plaintiffs cannot bring a lawsuit under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that was done recently. There's an appeal on that, which is going up. No other circuits have adopted this, but the fact is that it is something that is worth pointing out, because while the Department of Justice can always bring a claim under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and while it has always been the case through the history of the Voting Rights Act that all private plaintiffs have, this is something that is under attack in the Eighth Circuit. Next slide, please. One of the things that we wanted one of the people who are here to know is there is a wealth of information that is provided on our website. And in particular, we have issued guidance regarding Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and redistricting. There is a link to that here, and there are a series of links that will be shown at the end. Next slide. One of the things that I think is important to know is that the voting section itself, we look at suits nationwide, and there are many Section 2 lawsuits nationwide that are brought by private plaintiffs. And one of the things that we do to make sure that there is uniform enforcement is that we do statement of interest briefs. And so, for example, when there are arguments made by defendants, for example, that there shouldn't be a private right of action, you'll likely find us jumping in with this statement of interest, explaining how, in fact, the law does allow for private litigants to bring a lawsuit under Section 2. But there are many other Section 2 issues that we look at, and how the law is interpreted is very important to us. And so we weigh in on vote denial cases. We weigh in on vote dilution cases. We weigh in on redistricting cases. And the number of statement of interest briefs is quite substantial. And it is, again, located at the link. Next slide, please. We've also issued guidance concerning federal statutes affecting voting. Those were all of the ones that Kaylin had listed before. And that provides short and general information. And then likewise, we look at post-election audits and guidance on that. Next slide, please. This is the contact information for the voting section. That's our main number, 1-800-253-3931. And you can also make complaints. We have a portal through that, and you can submit a complaint via email. Likewise, if you want to reach me in person, my information is located there. My phone is 202-307-6262. And likewise, my email address is timothy.f.mellett@usdoj.gov. Last slide, please. And there are the resource links that we had talked about so that you can go and take a look at that. Again, I will be available at the Q&A section, as will all of us from the Department of Justice, to answer any of your questions.
Tierra here. Thank you all so much for that very, very informative presentation and all of the resources that you provided. As our friends from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights shared earlier, education is extremely important. So we are thankful that you all have taken the time to educate us on our rights as voters and the ways that the Department of Justice is working to prevent and address acts of hatred in the community. Next, we are going to hear from Isabella Silva, the Central Michigan Clerk Engagement Organizer at the ACLU. Ms. Silva is going to talk to us about how democracy needs you. And she's going to share the work that she and her colleagues have been doing with clerks around the state of Michigan and what they have learned through that process. Welcome, Ms. Silva. We are very glad to have you here with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabella Silva. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Central Michigan Clerk Engagement Organizer for the ACLU of Michigan. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm going to talk to you about the critical work of protecting and upholding democracy, a mission that is at the forefront of our organization this year. Our freedom to vote is a fundamental right that empowers us to have a say in decisions that impact our lives and communities. As we gear up for the 2024 election, we need all of us to ensure that every eligible voter has access to the ballot. With the passage of 2 citizen-initiated constitutional amendments, first in 2018 and again in 2022, Michigan revolutionized its voting system. We went from one of the states with the most restrictive voting laws in the country, with restrictions on paid transportation to the polls, and being one of the only states without early voting. The state is now leading the way in expansion for voting rights across the country. In 2024, Michigan voters will have more options than ever to cast their ballot, with options like a minimum of 9 days of in-person early voting, signing up to receive absentee ballots in the mail before every election, and the ability to tabulate an absentee ballot at an early voting site or in person on election day. Communities across the state are dedicated and our hardworking election officials are implementing these important changes every day. Local election officials, specifically municipal clerks, carry out our local and statewide elections and are on the front lines of our democracy. But they can't do this crucial work alone. The ACLU of Michigan is working at the local level to ensure that municipal election administrators, with the support of community members, fulfill the promises of the constitutional amendments and protections and the hard-won rights of Michiganders in the last couple of years. Through deep relationship building and advocacy, we are strengthening structures in democracy so that our voting system works for everyone. And in the pursuit of safeguarding democracy, it's imperative to acknowledge the challenges faced by local municipal clerks and their election officials. Unfortunately, a concerning trend has emerged where election officials across the nation are increasingly becoming targets of threats and harassment. A study done last year by the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University showed that threats and harassment of local election officials are at a consistently high baseline. In any given 3-month period in 2023, nearly half of election officials who responded to the group's survey indicated that they have been insulted, a third they've been harassed, or nearly 1 in 5 have been threatened. In addition, the study has shown that threats and harassment are even more common for racial and ethnic minorities and for women as well. The findings of the study highlight the need for collective action to address and mitigate some of the pressure that local officials and election administrators are facing as they work to carry out our elections. Election officials whose commitment to the democratic process is really commendable and deserve a work environment free from intimidation and fear. In the last year, the ACLU of Michigan has taken a proactive grassroots approach to safeguarding our elections by facilitating relationship building between community leaders and election officials. Through regular communication and collaboration with clerks' offices, our clerk engagement teams work to ensure that clerks are well equipped to serve their communities effectively in 2024 and beyond. We strive to understand clerks' concerns and coordinate with their offices to ensure voters can successfully cast their ballot. We understand the pressure that clerks are under to successfully implement Proposal 2 of 2022, and the ACLU of Michigan stands ready to support and uplift and also provide supplemental education to our communities. We know there are challenges that may arise with a significant transition, and we're dedicated to fostering an environment that facilitates smooth election administration, but also builds trust and understanding between clerks and the communities that they serve. Our commitment goes beyond rhetoric. We actively work to dismantle barriers that hinder democratic participation, whether it's addressing voter suppression, fighting against restrictive voting laws, and expanding legislation, or advocating for inclusivity. Our goal is to create a democracy that truly reflects the diverse voices of our communities. By working towards a more inclusive and accessible electoral system, we ensure that the democracy truly represents the will of the people. To achieve these goals, we've been in partnership with the state, the Secretary of State's office, and our statewide allies that we're working with to pass the Michigan State Voting Rights Act. And that's specifically really during this legislative season. And so if this bill's passed, the bill will prohibit any form of voter denial, dilution, or suppression. It will also expand the number of jurisdictions that must translate election-related information into languages other than English, ensuring that marginalized communities in the state have equal opportunities to participate in the voting process. And lastly, if the Michigan Voting Rights Act is passed, it would enhance and clarify protections for voters with disabilities or those who require assistance regarding or guaranteeing that every citizen can exercise their right to vote with dignity and ease. The passage of the Michigan Voting Rights Act will secure our place as a national leader in protecting the rights of citizens and the integrity of the democratic system. But we know that that there's more to be done at the local level with this work. And that's why the ACLU has deployed 4 community organizers across the state to help facilitate coalition building and collaboration on voting rights at the local level. We're working in 56 key communities that have historically faced and are still facing barriers to accessing the ballot and are the most at risk for disenfranchisement. We are working alongside local community leaders and election officials to discuss what voting looks like in their community and where we can support each other. Conversations between community members and clerks offer an avenue for communicating the unique challenges that are affecting these communities and allow for an informed and tailored path forward. As you can see, collaboration and integration are at the heart of our impactful work. We recognize that a cohesive effort where various stakeholders work together and take each other's perspectives into consideration will yield the most significant results. Our programming includes initiatives that are aimed at educating the public, dispelling mis and disinformation, and facilitating direct engagement with local clerks. We know our success lies in the synergy of these tactics. Across the state, we're working with local clerks to address their staffing and funding concerns and advocacy organizations as well, with our local partners who have expertise in how to reach community members so we can really lend support to clerks in educating voters about their new voting options. By hearing our clerks' perspectives, we really can know where our capacity can be used, where we can fill in gaps, provide reassurance, and build stronger elections together. With a growing BIPOC population in West Michigan, we know that language accessibility is crucial in guaranteeing folks have what they need to exercise the right to vote. Ensuring access to translated materials such as ballots, voter registration forms, voter education materials, and prioritizing the recruitment of bilingual election inspectors is imperative to serving voters who have historically been left out of the electoral process. In Southeast Michigan, we're grateful to have disability rights organization, Detroit Disability Center, to have conducted 261 accessibility audits at polling places in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties on Election Day. The study revealed that only 16% of polling places audited met simple criteria for being accessible to voters with disabilities, such as accessible parking areas with a clear path to the building, an accessible entrance, and a fully operated voter access terminal. So disabled voters can cast their vote privately and independently. In meetings with clerks, we are advocating for many no and low cost solutions that Detroit Disability Power identified to ensure that voters with disabilities have a seamless experience so they can go vote. And this year, we will also be helping Detroit Disability Power perform these audits in areas they may have not been able to reach in 2022. In Central Michigan, we've deepened our relationships with local universities, focusing on students and youth voters. We're working with our local partners to equip students with resources and education they may need to have their voices heard in the electoral process. We are also working with clerks to expand campus voting options. We want to work with students and clerks to foster healthy and sustainable habits towards participating in democracy. The work that we're doing today is an investment in strengthening Michigan's democratic ecosystems for generations to come. We are building deeper trust in our elected officials and our elections and reinforcing the reasons why every vote counts. As we witness the landscape of political discourse shift, we cannot turn a blind eye to potential risks to civil rights. The threats that we face are not distant possibilities. They're knocking on our doors, and we must respond with a united front. The urgency lies in understanding the moments of crisis are not abstract scenarios confined to history books. They are lived experiences that are unfolding in our communities. Democracy is not static. It's a dynamic force that requires constant vigilance and active participation. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It thrives when individuals are actively engaged, informed, and willing to stand up for principles that form its foundation. The threats we face necessitate an organized grassroots response that is rooted in the very communities that make up the heart of Michigan. If you're inspired to engage with this work, head over to the ACLU of Michigan's website and learn more about how you can join one of our local engagement teams. Democracy needs you, not just in the grand moments of elections, but every day efforts to make a more inclusive, transparent, and accessible democratic ecosystem. The urgency is now. The call is clear. Democracy needs you. Michigan needs you. And together, we stand as guardians of the democratic principles that define us. Thank you all.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much, Ms. Silva, for sharing about the very important work that you are doing at the ACLU. And I'm sure we will have questions for you during the Q&A session. Right now, joining us is Clerk Lisa Brown, the Chief Elections Officer for Michigan's second most populous county, Oakland County, Michigan. So far, we have learned about how acts of hatred tend to increase during general election years, the laws that are in place to protect us from such acts, and the preventative work that is being done to stay ahead of the issues. Clerk Brown is now going to walk us through what to do if we experience issues at the polls. Thank you so much for joining us today, Clerk Brown.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Lisa Brown, the Oakland County Clerk Register of Deeds, and I go by the pronouns she and her. And I am honored to be part of this panel as well as this program. With the passage of Proposal 2 in 2022, as was previously mentioned, we really enshrined some wonderful voting rights in our state constitution, including the right to a secret ballot, but also the right to vote without being threatened or harassed or intimidated. And anyone can bring, a Michigan citizen may bring a civil action in their circuit court in their county for relief in a civil manner, meaning like money or injunctive relief, saying, hey, you have to make this person stop, declaratory relief, those sorts of things. So that's something new, to have that right to be able to vote without being harassed, that right, which seems like, well, shouldn't you have already have had that? Yes, but it's now enshrined in our Constitution from the passage of Proposal 22-2. In addition, under Michigan criminal law, it's a felony to attempt, and I'm going to read the language from the statute itself. It's a felony for a person to attempt by means of bribery, menace, or other corrupt means or device, either directly or indirectly, to influence an elector in giving his or her vote, or to deter the elector from or interrupt the elector in giving his or her vote at any election held in the state. Now, voter intimidation can come from numerous sources. It can occur in different ways. It may be unintentional. And to me, an example of unintentional would be somebody's watching the national news and they see them talking about a news story where felons who have served their sentence out cannot vote in some other state. Knowing the difference that that is not the law in Michigan, and that a felon, right? So that could be intimidating to think, oh, if that applies to me, I can't vote. Well, no, that's a law somewhere else. So understanding when you're watching national news or looking at social media that we have different laws in different states, even when it comes to elections and voting and who can vote, eligibility for vote. So that could be an unintended intimidation, I think, is to hear something like that. In addition, you don't know where it may come from, who it may come from, and at what part of the voting process it may happen, right? So again, with that being either misinformation, disinformation, or disinformation that is right for another state, it may not happen when you're actually casting your ballot, but it is still a way that a voter may feel intimidated. Another example maybe of something that could be intimidating for one voter, but not for another voter. And an example of that would be a law enforcement presence at a precinct. I've had people, especially more recently than not, say, what are you going to make sure that everyone, is safe when they go vote? You've got to have law enforcement outside of the precincts. And I said, no, I can't do that, because the presence of law enforcement may intimidate a voter to going and cast their ballot. So, it's this dichotomy, I guess, of what people, what people need or think they need at the ballot, when they go vote, but also not realizing what could intimidate a voter and disenfranchise a voter from going and casting their ballot. I've got a few anecdote stories to share. I've been in this position for over 11 years, so I've seen a few different things, including when I went to go vote last year, walked into my precinct and the election worker said, you've got to fill out that application and give me your ID. Otherwise, you have to show your ID. And I kind of looked at him and I said, unless I don't have ID and I fill out the affidavit on the back of the application. And he kind of made a face and shrugged his shoulders like, yeah, whatever. Like, doesn't want it. So I've seen election workers who really say, you have to show me your ID. Well, if you don't have an ID, you can still vote, but that might be intimidating to someone who doesn't have an ID to think, oh, I have to have an ID. I don't have one. Now I can't vote. No, you can still vote. You have to just fill out an affidavit on the back of the application. A few years back, I was contacted by a voter who said that another voter in their precinct was turned away. And it was a local election. I think it was a school ballot proposal. The voter was wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. And, you can't wear campaign things, slogans or party or candidate or anything like that. But Black Lives Matter, that wasn't on the ballot. And that voter should not have been given a hard time. and however, I wasn't the right person to contact for that. I don't hire election day workers in the precinct. So in that regards, if it's an election worker that's giving you a hard time, you can either ask for the precinct chair or captain. And if that is not helpful, then take your issue to your local clerk, either your city or township clerk. And if you're not getting any help there, I would say then elevate it to reaching out to the State Bureau of Elections. Another election, we had workers who were turning away voters who had recently voted, recently registered at the Secretary of State's office, and they had their receipt from it, and it was dated properly. You know, they did it in the right time frame, and I think that maybe that clerk's office hadn't, I don't know, updated their poll list or something, and they were turning people away or giving them a hard time. I guess I'll say again, the right path for that. And again, people were calling me. I called the state because I don't have authority over the local clerks to tell them what to do, but the Bureau can do that. So contacting the Bureau of Elections is a great resource if you're having, again, an issue at the polls with a worker. Overzealous challengers may intimidate a voter. And I know Tim spoke about challengers a bit. And I just first want to clarify kind of what challengers can do and who may be a challenger. So automatically political parties may have challengers, no more than 2 per precinct. And other organizations and groups may have challengers. If they have to put it in writing, it has to be signed, it has to be notarized, you know, all these different requirements for them to have permission, I guess, to have challengers, but other groups may have challengers as well. And there's a long list of things that they can do. They can observe, they can stand behind the person who's checking in voters to see who's coming in to vote. One thing they cannot do is talk to voters directly. And again, I was in a precinct, not mine, but I was in a precinct, and I use the words overzealous challenger who was challenging a voter saying, I don't think that's you on your driver's license. Give me your driver's license. You're older than that picture, or you're younger than that picture, whichever it was. It's like, no, no, you don't get to do that. You're not, they shouldn't be talking directly to a voter, first of all. And again, as Tim mentioned, you know, they can't be based on impressions of a voter, whether it be the way that somebody's dressed or their challenge of reading or speaking English, the voter's perceived race, ethnic background, any physical or mental challenge they may have, support or opposition of a candidate or a political party or a ballot initiative, or the voter's need for assistance in completing their ballot. These are not things that can be challenged. A challenge has to be for good cause, a good faith belief that voter is ineligible. Like, well, hey, that's my neighbor across the street, and they had a for sale sign, and then it said sold, and I saw other people move in, so I don't think they live there anymore, right? Like something of a good faith belief that that person is not eligible to be voting. So again, if it's a challenger that is causing an issue, if an election worker isn't stepping in, I'd ask for the precinct chair or captain, again, elevating that then to the local or city clerk. And after that, elevating it to the Bureau of Elections at the state. So we've got these different levels. I know it's kind of confusing as to who do I contact, depending who's intimidating me. What does intimidation look like? And it's as I said, it's going to be different for different voters, right? Somebody else may feel comfort by seeing law enforcement outside of their precinct or in their precinct. Others may be intimidated by that. with the passage of proposals 18.3 and 22.2, as previously said, we now have more ways to vote, including no reason absentee voting. If you remember, that used to be only a list of reasons as to why you could vote absentee. Now anyone can do that. And a minimum of 9 days of early voting. Again, challengers can be at those locations as well. They can be in the clerk's office, standing there. They can be in an early voting site as well. So it's just knowing what someone can and cannot do. Challengers do need to be credentialed, but knowing what's okay, I think knowing what they can do will help empower a voter to know how do I word this? What they should feel uncomfortable about, and knowing when a challenger is crossing the line as to what they actually have the authority to do and challenge on. I think that's it for now. And I look forward to questions.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much, Clerk Brown, for sharing your insights. The information that you shared today is really very important for people to know as we gear up for the upcoming elections. And actually, we've learned some really valuable information from all of our presenters today. And I want to be sure that our viewing audience has a chance to ask questions. So at this time, we are going to transition to our question and answer portion of the program. As a reminder, participants are free to pose questions using the Q&A function located on the lower part of the screen. Also, I would ask all of our presenters to please turn on your camera and remember to state your name before speaking. I had a list of questions that I had prepared for each of you, but I see that we have many questions that sound much more interesting than the ones that I developed. So I'll start with those in the chat here. Our first question is, why and how are obvious lies, misinformation, and unfounded conspiracy theories allowed to be spread on the various social media platforms, especially radio and TV networks? And they ask, aren't these regulated by the government? And I think I'm going to toss this question over to our friends at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights first.
Thank you. I'm Nadia Aziz, Senior Director of the Fighting Hate and Bias Program at the Leadership Conference. Thank you for the question. Specific to social media platforms, there are teams that enforce policies related to disinformation and content moderation are not appropriately resourced. The amount of content and information that's posted just in one day is incredibly vast. And you have organized disinformation campaigns that try to get around certain policies. So really, one of the reasons why there are a lot of conspiracy theories, misinfo, disinfo circulated is because they haven't been, the platforms haven't been able to keep up with the climate. So, one of our recommendations was to resource their content moderation staff departments appropriately. It was to rebuild their content moderation, trust and safety, and disinformation monitoring teams, because there have been mass layoffs that have affected those departments. So there's a lot that can be done there. But I will say the TV networks part is a little out of my wheelhouse. So not sure if someone else wants to take that one.
Thank you. This is Tiara speaking. Ms. Pruss, would you like to speak to the last part of the question regarding whether or not these actions are regulated by the government?
There are regulations regarding television communications that are regulated by the FCC. That's not our jurisdiction. I think I would go back to some of the statements I made in my presentation regarding, in the broader public sphere, people do have First Amendment free speech rights. But again, there's limits to those speech rights when something rises to the level of a true threat. So if you're feeling threatened online, please let us know. Even if we can't do something immediately, that could be evidence later on of a broader motivation if another incident does arise. So don't be afraid of over-reporting if you think something might be rising to the level of a hate crime.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much for answering that question.
I add,
Sure,
add something
absolutely.
to that? Great. Okay, thank you. So I would just like to add that if someone sees, or hears something that they find questionable, to please either contact your local clerk, your county clerk. You can find a lot of information about voting on the Secretary of State's website, michigan.gov/vote. And please just don't believe something just because you're hearing it on TV, right? Or, oh, I saw it on the internet. Check with a trusted source, and hopefully that is your clerk. Thank you.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for adding that. Another question that we have is, are you seeing those committing hate crimes using religion as a reason for their actions? And I am going to ask perhaps Mr. Livingston or Ms. Pruss or our friends at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights to tackle this question.
I can say that for our office, I don't know that we have seen that anything related to religion there. In a normal hate crime investigation, it goes to the FBI, and they use local police working with the FBI will work up an investigation and then bring it to DOJ to charge. We're usually involved in that. Sometimes it is very difficult to get at what the intent and to find the requisite intent to charge something as a hate crime, that both that bias is present. But I would not say that anecdotally I've heard any rise that's related to the religion of the person being charged or being investigated for a hate crime.
Oh, I'll add that, we have seen some hate crimes clearly motivated by white supremacy that are targeting people of different religious groups. We've had 2 prosecutions this year where synagogues were threatened, one with a bomb threat in East Lansing and one with graffiti in the Upper Peninsula. And again, as the process was as the trial explained, but with the bomb threat, we were involved immediately because we prevented it could have been a catastrophe, and the motivation there, was clearly anti-Semitism. So we have seen some of those incidents recently. And as the ADL will tell you, if they were here, there has been an increase nationwide in hate crimes against Jews and Muslims over the past year.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you both. Going to another question. There is a comment regarding broken trust between American Muslims and law enforcement. And the question is, what can be done to rebuild this trust? And would Islamophobia be explicitly named in the recommendations?
Guess that's probably for us at DOJ as well. And I think that recognizing the history is the first step for us. In our district, we've had for about the last 20 years our Bridges program, which is trying to bridge connections between the Arab American Muslim community and law enforcement that happened in the wake of 9/11. It is an ongoing conversation, and I think the way that we build the trust is showing up to communities, making sure that they understand our commitment. And one of the things we can do in our action in our district in the last 5 or 6 years, we bought 3 RLUPA cases related to protecting the religious rights of Muslims to practice in a mosque in Sterling Heights, a mosque in the city of Troy, and a Islamic school in Pittsfield Township. So through our work, we can show our connection and our community and try to earn that trust, but we understand that we have to earn it.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Mr. Livingston.
May I add a little bit to that on top of that, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Completely agree with everything Mr. Livingston said. And I wanted to note there has indeed been a lot of harm that's been done to the relationship between American Muslims, Arab Americans, and their government in the wake of September 11th and ongoing. And one important way to help rebuild those relationships is exactly what Mr. Livingston said. It's to engage with these communities as neighbors, as our citizens, as our colleagues, and not as a quote partner in fighting terrorism. There's a securitized relationship there that's really important to acknowledge and is key to rebuilding the trust, is engaging with these communities as we would any other community.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much for that, Ms. Aziz. And just a reminder to our panelists here, please remember to state your name before proceeding to speak. I am going to direct this next question to Lisa Brown, Clerk Brown. It was actually posed to you. It says, what would you like to see from the Michigan legislature that would help local and county clerks deal with voter intimidation? Also, is there anything that the legislature can do that would help clerks overall?
Oh, that's a lot. How much time do we have? You know, I actually serve on the legislative committee for the Michigan Association of County Clerks, so I'm very active in the legislation that either legislation that the clerks would like to see. I'm also on. We have a committee that is a joint committee of municipal clerks and county clerks, so I serve on that as well. And we just talk about election issues in that committee. So I'm quite active in that. I'm a former legislator. I was a state representative for 2 terms. So having that experience, and I hate to drop names, but I talk to Jeremy Moss, Senator Jeremy Moss, quite often. He is a friend. He's a longtime friend, and he's currently the chair of the Senate Elections Committee. And there's a long list of things. I don't want to say long. There are still many things that clerks could use statutorily to help us. And we are working on those. Some of the things have to do with, honestly, with recounts. I mean, we just held a recount in Oakland County that, you know, they're challenging things that aren't part of a recount. And we dealt with this last year as well. A recount is to retabulate the ballots that were counted on election day, or for that election. You know, now we have pre-processing, but you know, these people are saying, well, I want to be able to see the stubs and I want to see the back of the ballot. And no, that's not what a challenge is. So being able to hammer that out so we don't have to deal with that hostility when we're doing a recount, things like that. That's just one of the things. There's a long list, but I don't want to keep saying long list. There's a list, and I am working on them, and my colleagues and I are working on them. I'm sorry, this is Lisa Brown speaking. Sorry, I didn't say that from the beginning.
That's okay. This is Tiara speaking. Our next question I'm going to pose to Mr. Millett. The question says, I don't quite understand how polarized voting is qualified as a voting rights violation. Can you please share a bit more on that?
Sure. So, you know, it's one of those things about a limited presentation. If I were giving a longer presentation, I could have given you part B of that statute under Section 2. Section 2, and it is helpful, actually, if you go and you look at the statute itself under Section 2. But that part B specifically talks about this. When it says that a violation is established if, based on the totality of circumstances, it is shown that the political processes leading to nomination or election in the jurisdiction are not equally open to participation by members of a class of citizens that are protected. And what it specifically talks about is it says the extent to which members of a protected class have been elected to office in the state or political subdivision is one circumstance which may be considered. And the other thing that that talks about is that the ability to elect representatives of their choice. So it's really part B of Section 2 that discusses that particular part of it. There is a caution at the end of that, which is that Section 2 does not require proportionality. So, meaning that just because the Black population may be 1/3 of a jurisdiction, it doesn't mean that 1/3 of the elected representatives have to be from that minority group. It just means that the process needs to be open so that there is an ability to elect a candidate of choice.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for sharing, Mr. Millett. Our next question is, are there legislative initiatives that we can support that are designed to address the recommendations in the report we just heard? Is there a place we can go to find those legislative initiatives in our individual states? And I think I'm going to ask Ms. Silva and Ms. Nguyen and Ms. Aziz perhaps to address that one. If you are able.
I can jump in first. Thank you for the question. One of the great things about being a national civil rights coalition is that we have so many wonderful partners that we can point people to. So I would direct folks to specifically for the issues we mentioned in our cause for concern report. I direct folks to the Human Rights Campaign's website, hrc.org. They have a ton of information that tracks these bills at the state level and has information on what you can do as well.
This is Tiara speaking. I seem to have lost my questions here. Here they are. If there is no state statute, how long does it usually take for the DOJ to prosecute hate crimes? What is the DOJ backlog regarding hate crimes investigations? And I'm going to pose that question to Ms. Pruss.
Yeah, and Latrell, feel free to jump in here. I wouldn't say we have a backlog. I think it's just what Latrell mentioned. Sometimes it takes a while to investigate these matters because proving motivation is so difficult. Where that is less difficult than the investigation, which takes place with the FBI and local law enforcement, moves more quickly. So don't ever be afraid to report something because you think there's a backlog. On the criminal side, if the evidence is there, we have the ability to move rather quickly. On the civil side, things can take a while to develop. As I mentioned in my presentation, under certain statutes, like in a housing matter, for example, we recently reached a settlement with a landlord in Muskegon who was sexually assaulting his tenants. It took quite a while to find women who have the courage to come forward and to build that case and to develop it and file a complaint. Those cases can take a much longer time to develop, but again, it's not a backlog issue. It's just getting enough evidence. So that's why it's so important for people to come forward.
This is Latrell Livingston. I would completely agree with what Kaylin has had to say. And as she alluded to on the criminal side in the Western District, they've had a couple of synagogue cases. I can tell you that we have prosecuted in our office a couple of race-based hate crimes in the last couple of years. One out of Saginaw where a person was hanging nooses at Starbucks coffee and threatening folks for their support of Black Lives Matters. And we brought that as a threat prosecution, and that we were able to move swiftly. It took a little while for the case to develop, but we opened it very quickly. And similarly, in Monroe County, at a beach, a white gentleman attacked Black teenagers with a bike lock, telling them that they weren't welcome in this community. And our office, in coordination with local law enforcement, the FBI, and the Monroe County Prosecutor's Office, was able to bring that case under the Shepard-Byrd hate crimes law.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you both. I have another question. Have you heard of any instances of the new intimidation law being invoked in relation to the presence of firearms at a polling location? And also there's a question regarding how to protect poll workers. And I am going to pose that question to Clerk Brown, perhaps.
Okay, so nothing on the guns yet, but I do want to say, and I was trying to look before to see where legislation was with all that, but because there's been so much, but you know, a lot of our polling locations are places where you cannot carry a concealed weapon, right? Places of worship, schools, you cannot carry a concealed weapon already just for what the building actually is. And as far as intimidation of election workers, there is a new law that is going into effect February 13th that does protect election workers from harassment, intimidation, et cetera. So it's giving, and that is a misdemeanor for the first 2 offenses of that. After 3 or more, it becomes a felony. So that is another tool in the toolbox, I will say, I guess, to deter harassment in our polling location and of our workers. Thank you. Sorry, this is Lisa Brown speaking. Sorry, I keep forgetting to say it at the beginning.
Thank you. This is Tiara speaking. Next question. Someone says, I was wearing a t-shirt that said, pray, vote, pray when I walked into my precinct. I was asked to zip up my hoodie so it did not show. Is this legit? They also note that the precinct location was a church.
So precinct location shouldn't matter. What's on the ballot actually is what matters more so. So it's hard for me to kind of answer that question. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say no, there wasn't a problem. It may have been an extra sensitive election worker, and that is I'll say a remedy for somebody who is wearing something that they shouldn't be wearing, is to put on a jacket or turn the shirt inside out. I can't imagine, but maybe there was something on your ballot having to do with, I don't know, praying or something. I don't know. I can't imagine what that would be. So I would say you probably did not have to zip up your jacket, but without knowing all the facts of what was on the ballot and all that, I can't say 100%. Again, this was Lisa Brown speaking.
Thank you. This is Tiara speaking. Next question is, given that Black Americans make up a large percentage of hate crimes, what is the DOJ doing to advocate and enforce a hate crime bill for Black Americans?
I'd be happy to take that question. This is Latrell Levinson speaking. As a first point, as DOJ employees, we're not able to advocate for any statutory changes. We take what Congress gives us and enforce those laws. But on the positive end, we do have statutes that exist already that allow us to enforce hate crimes against Black Americans. The history of the Department of Justice is grounded in the Reconstruction period, when DOJ was engaged to fight against the KKK in the South. And that is, there are statutes dating back to those days that still give us ability to enforce for threats against Black Americans. Similarly, the James Byrd and Matthew Shepard Crime Prevention Act is, in its name, James Byrd Jr. was a Black American who was brutalized in a hate crime in Texas. And so that law does allow us to proceed and investigate and prosecute hate crimes against Black Americans and any other hate crimes that are based on a target of race or any of the protected categories that Ms. Pruss discussed in her presentation.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Mr. Levinson. And we are nearing the close of our program, so I may be able to get to maybe 2 more questions. Let's see. This question is for Clerk Brown. What is the biggest threat facing election workers that needs further legislation?
This is Lisa Brown speaking. It's a good question. Whatever the biggest threat is to election workers, and I guess maybe it's just hostility, right? At this point, we do now have that law in place that will take effect February 13th. So I I don't think we need further legislation at this point because we do have a law that will take effect February 13th, protecting election workers from intimidation and harassment. Thank you.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Clerk Brown. Let's see. Is the Department of Justice looking into the disproportionate enforcement of city ordinances against Arab and Bengali Americans in Hamtramck? What if the individuals potentially committing the acts of bias are local law enforcement? I'll read it again. Is the department, I'm sorry, it just disappeared on me. 1 second. Is the Department of Justice looking into the disproportionate enforcement of city ordinances against Arab and Bengali Americans in Hamtramck? That's question 1. And then what if the individuals potentially committing acts of bias are local law enforcement? I'm not sure if our friends at the Department of Justice want to take a stab at answering these questions.
Not surprisingly, we are not going to comment on any pending or potential investigations, but I would say that we do stand ready to investigate local officials for corruption, for violation of civil rights, and have taken actions across the country against communities where we found some violation of federal law.
And I'll just add on the, this is Kaylin Press. On the ordinance question, this is a slightly different topic, but one of DOJ's initiatives presently is looking at the enforcement of anti-nuisance ordinances against certain communities, like victims of domestic violence or disabled communities or Black communities, to try to limit access to housing. So, when ordinances are being used in a discriminatory manner, that's certainly an area of great interest right now.
This is Tim Mellett. The one thing I also wanted to add is if the questioner has particular information, one of the things that we would also say is that you can contact the U.S. Attorney's Office to provide information about what you know.
Thank you, Tim. And you can actually contact me directly, and I will ask Tiara to put my contact information in the chat for all the presenters.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you all so much. I will also add that the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination in the area of law enforcement. The Michigan Department of Civil Rights also accepts complaints of discrimination if you feel that you are being discriminated against by a law enforcement official based on one of the protected categories. So we are also a resource in that regard. With that said, we have come to the end of the time for our session. I would like to thank all of our presenters for their time and the presentations that they have conducted for us today. Many of them, again, have provided their contact information and many resources for you in the chat. I would also like to thank all of our registered participants who have joined us today for this session. We welcome you to join us at our next forum, which is scheduled for Thursday, February 22nd, 2024. This will be a special event held in person in Warren, Michigan, and it will feature a roundtable discussion with Politico magazine editor Zach Stanton and many of the people involved in the case concerning the Bailey family who integrated the city of Warren back in the 1960s. To find registration information for this event and to learn more about the My Response to Hate campaign, please visit the Michigan Department of Civil Rights website at www.michigan.gov/MDCR. We hope to see you next month. And remember, eliminating hate and bias in our state is all of our responsibility. Wishing you a safe election year, and we thank you again for joining us today.